Welcome students. I hope this semester is starting out well for you, not only for this class but for your other classes also. Today we're going to get into some statistical content for the first time. If you remember, the first lecture was about study habits. Today's lecture will have 4 parts or 4 segments, and in between those segments you'll have questions that you'll answer similar to what you saw in the very first lecture. Now ultimately this semester what we would like to do is we would like to learn how to do hypothesis testing, and we'll talk more about that later. We also want to learn about scientific research analysis to answer those important questions related to human behavior. But first, before we can talk about hypothesis testing and research analysis, we first need to know the basics in statistics, and that's what this lecture is all about. So we'll start off and we'll talk about the 2 basic categorizations of statistics. We'll then follow that up with the characteristics of the variables that are used to measure the constructs of interest. The 2 basic types of statistics are called descriptive statistics and inferential statistics, and their names kind of give you a hint as far as what their purpose is. Descriptive statistics, just as it sounds, describes something of interest. Inferential statistics tells us that we can infer some sort of conclusion based on some analysis that we conduct. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the name of the 2 general categories of statistics tells us what their purposes are. So when I say descriptive statistics, we're trying to describe something using a numerical value. And so we can say that descriptive statistics describe a characteristic of a group that has been directly measured. And what we mean by directly measured is that everything in that group has been measured on some variable. An example of a descriptive statistic might be that professional soccer players are on average 6 feet tall. And so the numerical value 6 describes the height of professional soccer players, in this case in feet. And so soccer players are on average 6 feet tall is a descriptive statistic. Now it's important to point out that soccer players may be taller, they may be shorter, but on average it's 6 feet tall. And again, for it to be a descriptive statistic, we would have to directly measure the height of every single professional soccer player. So in this case, we've measured all the soccer players, and we get a descriptive that on average they're 6 feet tall. Another example might be that there are 25,436 students enrolled at Auburn University. So again, this is another descriptive statistic. We have a number, 25,436, and it describes the number of students enrolled at the university. Now again, for this to be a descriptive statistic, that means we would have to measure, or count in this case, every single student that's enrolled at the university. And then finally, because I am a minivan owner, I may want to know what percentage of registered vehicles are minivans. And so if we look at some DMV records, we can get a percent, and in this case it's 7.9% of registered vehicles, and so I can proudly state that I am in the 8% of registered vehicles, which are minivans. The other general type of statistics is called inferential statistics. Now just like with descriptive statistics, the name kind of gives away its purpose. So when we say inferential, what we're saying is that we would like to infer something from one group to another group. In particular, we want to infer the characteristics of a population from a sample. Now we'll talk about what population and samples are in a little bit here, but what's important to note is that when we gather information about a sample, the data that we collect describes that sample. But that's not the purpose of inferential statistics. The purpose of inferential statistics is to take that descriptive information and infer it to a population that we have not measured. And that's what makes it inferential. So when you're categorizing inferential and descriptive statistics, you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose? If the purpose is just to describe a group, then it's descriptive statistics. If the purpose is to infer to a group that we haven't measured, then it's inferential statistics. So an example of an inferential statistic might be that Auburn men on average are 6 feet tall based on a sample of 300 men living in Auburn. And so you'll see something here is that we didn't actually measure every single male that lives in the city limits of Auburn. What we did is we took a small sample of 300 men, we measured each one of them, we got their height, and we calculated an average of 6 feet. We then infer that measurement of 6 feet to all men in Auburn, or the population. And so we haven't actually measured all men in Auburn, but we will infer their height is 6 feet tall on average based on the sample of 300 men that we actually did measure. And so that's an inferential statistic. The purpose is to, in this case, describe the population without actually measuring the entire population, and that's what makes it inferential. So another example might be that there are 7 billion people living on Earth based on a sample of 23 countries' censuses. So we haven't measured or counted every single person living on the Earth. What we did is we took censuses from 23 countries and we infer the overall total population on the Earth. And so again, that's inferential statistics. It's our best guess based on our sample of 23 countries. And so a final example might be that 12.3% of engineers in the U.S. are women based on a sample of 267 U.S. engineers. So again, we didn't look at every single engineer and ask if they were male or female in the U.S. What we did is we took a sample of 267, and 12.3% of those 267 engineers were female. And so we infer, or we guess, based on that sample, that in the population of engineers, 12.3% are women. And so that's inferential statistics. We take descriptive information from a sample and we use it to infer to a population. So again, don't be confused that when you have population information or you have inferential statistics, that's usually based on a sample that's based on descriptive statistics. So inferential statistics will contain descriptive statistics, but again, its categorization is based on the purpose. In this case, the purpose is to take that descriptive information and infer it to a much larger population that we actually haven't measured. So when you're asked to categorize whether something is descriptive or inferential, make sure you look at the purpose. What is the goal when you're given that categorization? If the goal or the purpose is that you only care about the group being measured, then that's a descriptive statistic. But if your purpose or your goal is to estimate to those that are not measured, then that is classified as inferential statistics. So look at the goal, the purpose of what you're doing with the analysis, and that'll tell you if it's descriptive or if it's inferential. Now when we talked about inferential statistics, I threw out two terms and I hadn't defined them yet, so let's make sure we talk about what populations and samples are. A population includes all observations of something of interest. And I know that sounds pretty vague, but it's meant to be. The reason why is because the researcher decides what the population is and what it consists of. And so a population could be of anything that is of particular interest to the researcher. Some examples of populations include the height of all men in Auburn, the number of all people living in the U.S., and the number of all female engineers in the U.S. And so note here that the population changes depending on whatever the researcher is interested in measuring. So the researcher defines the population of interest. And so the population can always be changing. And so if the researcher is interested in just measuring the height of all men in Auburn, then that would be a population. But if the researcher was interested in measuring all people in Alabama, or all females in the U.S., or all men in the world, realize that each of those could be populations. It just depends on what the researcher is interested in studying. So the researcher defines the population of interest, and it's always continually changing. The other important thing to note is that populations are usually difficult to measure. That usually they're too large. Usually it takes too many resources to measure everyone in the population. And so researchers are generally strapped for cash, usually strapped for time, and usually strapped for help with a research assistance or whatever it may be. So in most cases populations are too large to measure. Now again, that's usually, so it doesn't always mean that populations are too large. So for example, if I was a researcher and I wanted to study the academic outcomes of students in my statistics class, and I define that as my population, well, I could measure every single student in my statistics class. I see them on a regular basis, and I see their academic performance within the class. So in that case, my population isn't too large to measure. But just remember, in most cases, for most behavioral sciences, populations are usually too large to measure. When it comes to analyses, it's important to remember that with populations, that the measurement matters. And so when we describe populations, we have to include the measurement. So different measures require different populations, even if you're measuring the same group. For example, if I was to measure men in Auburn and I wanted to measure their height and their weight, I'd have to remember that there are two populations there. There's one population for height of all men in Auburn, and then there's a second population of the weight of all men in Auburn. So I'm measuring the same people, but I'm getting two measurements, and the measurements that differ require different populations. So even though I'm measuring the same people, the measurement itself tells me I have two different populations. Now this is important for statistical analysis purposes, that when we analyze data, that we put each variable, whether it's height or whether it's weight, in their own columns in a spreadsheet to be analyzed. And so they have to represent two different populations, even though they're coming from the same people. Alright, so when we're describing a population, there's three things that we need to make sure we include. So these three things are that we need to include who or what is being measured. We also need to include the specific measurement itself. And then lastly, we have to include the number of observations in the population if it's provided. So when we say who or what is being measured, in this example that's above, we see that men in Auburn are being measured. So that's who or what. In this case it's a who, it's men in Auburn. But realize it doesn't have to be people, it can be things as well. If we're measuring bicycle parts or something like that, then bicycles might be what's being measured. But in this case it's men, so we'll say who. The second thing, the specific measurement itself. So we need to indicate whether it's height or weight. And remember, it can't be both, right? Because they're two separate populations. That every time we take a measurement, even of the same person, if they're different measurements, then we're talking about two different populations. So we'll include height or weight. We wouldn't include both. We would have to have two separate population descriptions for each of those. And then lastly, the number of observations in a population needs to be included as well. And so if we have measured every single person or thing in that population, then we can include that specific number. If we don't know, if we're inferring to a much larger population where we can't count everyone in that population, then we can just say all. But whenever we give a population description, we need to include who or what's being measured, the specific measurement itself, and then also the number of observations. In other words, the population size. So let's go ahead and talk about samples now. And samples are very similar to populations in their descriptions. And so not much changes here, it's just the definition and how it's being used. And so a sample is a subset of the population. It's a smaller portion of that population. And so examples might include the height of 300 men living in Auburn. We've talked about that one already. Or the counts of citizens from 23 countries. Or another sample description might be 267 female engineers in the U.S. In this case, each of those might be samples. And in each case, it's a subset of a larger population. So the height of 300 men living in Auburn, there's more than 300 men living in Auburn, and so 300 men is a subset of all men living in Auburn. 23 countries is a subset of all countries in the world. And 267 female engineers is a subset of all female engineers. Now remember, the whole purpose of a sample is to infer back to the population. And so we're never really interested in the sample itself. We're interested in the sample and how it can infer to a larger population. So a sample is a subset of the population. And because we're using that sample to infer to the population, we say the sample is used as a proxy for the population. It's our best guess, it's our estimate of what the population is like, without us having to actually measure the entire population. So a sample can be easily measured. So as a researcher, I get to pick my sample. I can pick my sample size and who's going to be in my sample. And so I can make sure that the sample can be easily measured. Whereas a population usually can't be easily measured. And that's what makes samples a proxy for the population. Something that can be easily measured that we can infer to the population. Now the process for describing samples is very similar to the process for describing populations. In fact, sample descriptions include the same things as a population description, except for point number 3 is that there's always going to be a sample size. So remember, when it's a population, sometimes we just say all, right? We don't have a number, we can't measure everything in the population, so we just say all. But with a sample, because it's easily measured, we will always have a sample size. In other words, the number of observations that are being measured. And so, just like with the population, different measurements require different sample descriptions. So if I'm measuring female engineers and I'm measuring female drivers, even if I'm measuring the same people, If I'm talking about engineers in one case and drivers in the other case, then I'm talking about two separate populations, even if it's the same 267 people that I measure. So two sample descriptions might be 267 female engineers in the US. Another one might be 267 female drivers in the US. And so a sample description includes who or what is being measured. In this case, we're talking about females in the US. The specific measurement itself, so either we're talking about frequency of drivers or frequency of engineers, but not both, because remember, if there's two different measurements, then we're talking about two different samples. And then lastly, the number of observations in the sample. So in this case, we're measuring 267 females, so 267 is my sample size. I want to include that in my description as well. Now that we have a basic understanding of samples and populations, let's go ahead and let's muddy the water a little bit and let's talk about norming. So norming is a process where we treat information about samples as if it is the population. So we're not talking about inferring here. We're not talking about inferring from samples to populations. What we're saying is that we have measured a large sample that is very diverse. And so when I mean large, we're talking about usually tens of thousands. So we're talking about thousands of individuals or thousands of things. And we're going to treat that very diverse sample or series of samples as if the results from those samples are the results in the population. So we're not inferring here. We're saying that this sample information is the population information, and we call that norming. So large, robust samples can be equated to populations, and that's what's called norming. So census data is a good example of this. We don't actually measure everyone that's living in the U.S. when we collect census data. There's some people that we miss, and so maybe we miss people who are out of the country. Maybe we miss people that are living in the country that aren't citizens. Maybe they're undocumented workers. So we're always missing people, maybe people in rural areas. And so the data we collect really isn't every single person in the United States. But because we're collecting data on millions of people, that we can equate it to those few that we've missed. And so in this case, it's a very large, diverse, robust sample. And so we can treat the data we gather from the census as if it represents the population. And so we'll equate it with the population. So in that case, we're not inferring. We're saying this sample data from the census that we've collected is the population information. We do the same thing with standardized scores for like the ACT, the SAT, the GRE. And so we don't actually measure every single high school or college student, but the samples that we do measure are very large. We're talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of students. And so the sample is so large and so diverse that it represents the population. And so we're not saying that we're inferring to the population. We're saying this is the population information based on these very large, very robust samples. And so that's called norming. Now, norming is actually a very involved process, and if you'd like to know more about it, I've included an article on norming on Canvas, and you can take a look at that if you like. I realize that most of you won't. It's not required reading, but if it's interesting to you and you want to read about norming, you can go ahead and look at that article. It talks about the process that it takes in order for us to treat samples as if it is the population. So that concludes the very first segment of this lecture. And so if you click on the arrow at the bottom of the screen, it'll take you to the review questions. Go ahead and answer those review questions, and when you're done with those, we'll move on to the second segment of Lecture 2.